Talofa, it's time to level up your Pacific knowledge with Pacific Level Up Episode 7, which is looking at Pacific Navigation and Canoes. And today I have a special guest, Professor Vincente Diaz, or Vince Diaz, and he's joining me from the States where he's a professor. Professor Diaz works at the University of Minnesota, a former colleague of mine when we were at the University of Michigan. He's a scholar, a sailor, and a canoe guy, and that's why he's the guy we want to talk about this stuff with. Pacific Level Up, just a quick reminder, is a COVID-era inspired course which is giving short, sharp knowledge lessons about the Pacific. This is Vince Diaz, who will be joining shortly. He was born and raised in Guam, but has genealogy that takes him back to the wonderful island of Pohnpei. He's built and sailed canoes for decades now, especially on the island of Guam, which, if you remember, is a US territory. And so he's coming with us today to talk about his work with canoes. He's currently doing some work with local Native American peoples in Minnesota, and also he used to play, and he'll be very happy I mentioned this, he used to play American football when he was at the University of Hawaii. So let's go over to Vince.
Well, thank you, Damon. It's really exciting to be here. What I wanted to do was basically introduce Micronesian canoes to the audience, and rely on two things: the question, so why canoes anyway, especially for the 21st century. But I also wanted to use as an example some of the canoe projects that we're working on here in Minnesota, because a big part of the answer of why canoes for me, as someone from Micronesia originally, has to do with canoes being pretty amazing native technologies and objects and knowledge systems associated with canoes are also some of the, I think, some of the most important things that we can do as Pacific Islanders to figure out how to not only survive but flourish in the 21st century for the future. So the question is, why canoes? When we pay attention to the technology and the cultural knowledge and the environmental knowledge that's associated with canoes, we find that canoes continue to provide us with the vessels. So that's really, canoes are vessels, right? They have great carrying capacity. They can carry us both physically and geographically, and also through time. So they turn out, and for me, to be really, really vital. The first thing that hit me when I started learning about this, and then eventually going to the different islands to learn how to build and sail, is this: our canoes are like incredibly beautiful objects. They're fine works of art, including the cultures associated with it, but also the knowledge that's associated with building canoes and with using them, and especially with navigating long distances. They're remarkable feats of science and engineering, and a unique kind of science and technology that comes out of our collective traditions. There's been a long tendency for modern Western people to dismiss natives as backwards, as maybe good only for dancing and singing, or maybe good for your football teams and rugby, and which we are, by the way. But we're obviously more than that. And we come from maritime, ocean, marine civilizations. Distinguishing features of a canoe across the Pacific, but certainly in Micronesia, is the outrigger, the float off on one side of the hull. The hull is the main body. that float is called a tam. It's in Polynesia, the cognate is ama, and keeps stability for the hull. And it was developed thousands of years ago to be able to allow you to travel shallow waters with lots of reefs. So a typical Western boat has a deep keel. It's like a fin in the bottom of the boat that keeps it from tipping over. Our ancestors innovated and built in that balancing thing by putting it off to the side, having a float off to the one side. And that's one of the distinguishing features of a traditional Pacific Islander canoe. One of the things that in time, that float or pontoon, people realized that if you needed to be out in the water longer for a longer voyage, and you needed to carry more people and more food, you could replace that pontoon or float, the tam or the ama, with a second hull. And so now you have a double hull canoe that's connected with a platform. Now you can put bigger sails, you can carry more people. We have records of double hull canoes that go up to 100 feet and can carry 50, 60 people and food and water, and can be out there for months. One of the things that having a float off to the side requires is that if you have a sail, that float has to always be on the windward side. If always having to have the outrigger on the windward side where the wind is coming from, if you have to turn the canoe, if you're going in one direction, and then you have to turn and go the opposite direction, you can't turn the canoe around because that will put the outrigger on the opposite side. And so there's another feature of the Micronesian outrigger canoe, the way that that engineering problem was figured out was the sail, instead of turning the canoe around, the sail would be released from one end of the canoe and handed back or walked back to the other side. And so the canoe can go from one direction to the other direction without actually turning around, but simply moving the sail from one side to the other side. Because of that, when you look at a Micronesian canoe, both ends of the canoe are symmetrical. They're identical because you don't have a built-in steering paddle on one end because you've got to be able to switch from side to side. That outrigger and the ability to shift the sail from side to side is unique in our part of the world, and it continues wherever that outrigger technology spread. So there's knowledge how to build a canoe, how to build a seaworthy canoe that is up to the task of traveling thousands of miles or kilometers in the open ocean. But the knowledge is also about how do you sail long distances, using only stars, waves, clouds, sea creatures, swells, to know where you're going, to always know where you are. This is pretty amazing stuff. It involves long training, and lots of time out in the water learning to read the signs of nature. For example, you can kind of understand how stars rise and set, like the sun. The sun appears to rise in the east and travel overhead and set in the west. And so you can tell where where west and east is. And because of that, you can figure out where north is and where south is, right? But in the same ways, from the power of observing nature for thousands of years, navigators learned that stars, different constellations or groups of stars, rise and set around the same places and around the same times. And so as they rise and set across at different um, points in the horizon, in the same way that the sun rises, you can also begin to use those rising and setting points to identify the locations where other islands are. And so that's one of the cool ways that stars are used for directional purposes. But you can also know what direction you're going by the ability to identify different sets of swells out in the ocean. Swells are waves that were created from a distance. There's local waves, and there's waves that the wind or other natural phenomenon create, maybe an earthquake. And they're patterns. A good navigator can identify up to 6 or to 8 distinct sets of swells out in the open ocean. And these swells have distinct looks. They curl differently from each other. They move differently. And if you can identify and distinguish different swells and waves, you also know that these different swells and waves come from the directions of the rising and setting stars. And so a good navigator can actually figure out direction by reading and distinguishing and knowing not only the different swells and where they come from, but how those swells bend and refract around or reflect around islands. So those of us who grew up in modern times and pay attention, have lost attention to the ability to understand nature and its behavior, its patterns of behavior, might be out there and just see just a bunch of choppy waves. But for a trained navigator, there's very distinct things happening that tell you really useful things. I'm sure all of you saw Moana, Disney's Moana. Disney couldn't have worked with the people it worked with to create that film, to imagine that film for entertainment purposes without having drawn from the knowledge that continued in Micronesia. Islands like Polowat and Sadawal are really important for us because there they still continue to build and sail these big canoes using the ancient ways. Here we are in the 21st century, that's still a part of the life. They're kind of famous in our circles because it's there where the ancient tradition of outrigger building and the ability to sail long distances using stars, waves, clouds. Those of us from islands that lost that tradition, we look to them, we learn from them. This is the case with the Polynesian Voyaging Society in Hawaii. They also relied heavily on knowledge from Micronesia for this stuff. Canoe builders and navigators from Polowat here, and we built 2 new canoes. I have my canoe here with me, and we've got a new Micronesian outrigger canoe here, but we also built a Dakota canoe with them. And we're also made big inroads in a virtual reality canoe simulation. So you can put the goggles on and get into an outrigger canoe in Micronesian waters and pull the sail in, and you'll start moving. You can look around you 360 degrees. We can go from daylight to night, the night sky, and you can learn how stars are used for navigation. We can simulate being on a canoe. The guys in Milan can put this on and travel back to their island and learn how to do this. This is just the start. This is it for now. There's obviously just touched on some of the highlights of why canoes are important and a little bit about what the canoes look like and how they function. I've been studying and learning this stuff for 30 years, and this is just really I've already gone over time, so let me encourage you to open your eyes and check out all you can about canoe revitalization in Micronesia and across the whole Pacific.
I'd like to thank once again Professor Vince Diaz for joining us here at Pacific Level Up, sharing some of his knowledge about Pacific canoes and navigation, and taking us on that journey to our shared past on our shared vessels, Pacific canoes. Next up, we'll be looking at those canoes in action. We'll be covering sort of 40,000 years of history in 10 to 15 minutes, discovering the Pacific, because the first discoverers of the Pacific were, of course, the Pacific people who have been here for 40,000 years. We'll see you next time on Pacific Level Up.